I want to speak plainly today because there are truths that become heavier when leaders hide them behind polished words. My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and I am speaking not as a man standing above his people, but as a son of Burkina Faso who has watched too many mothers cry, too many families run, and too many children ask questions no child should ever have to ask. This is not a political speech. It is not an attack on the Christian faith. It is not a message meant to divide believers, pastors, priests, or communities. I am telling this story because I have seen something happening inside the Christian church, and many people have noticed it, but very few are willing to say it aloud. It began for me near the end of February, in the year 2026 in Ouagadougou. That morning, I had just finished an intense security meeting at the presidential palace. On the table before me was a map of Burkina Faso. It was not just a map of roads, regions, and borders, it was a map of pain. There were marks across the north, the east, the center nord, the Sahel, and Bouclé du Mahon. Each mark represented communities under pressure, families displaced by violence, schools that could not open, clinics that could not function, and villages where food had become uncertain. Reports spoke of about 4.5 million people needing humanitarian support. They spoke of more than 2 million people who had once been forced from their homes. But numbers, no matter how large, can become dangerous when we forget they are human beings. As I looked at those papers, I heard church bells ringing somewhere in the distance. The sound was soft, almost peaceful, but inside me it raised a question I could not escape. When a nation is wounded, where is the church standing? I had heard stories of pastors, priests, nuns, and ordinary believers serving quietly among the poor. I had seen people feeding the hungry, praying with the broken, burying the dead, and caring for orphans without asking for praise. That light still exists, but I had also seen something else. In some places, the church was becoming silent, afraid, formal, and distant from the real suffering of the people. That is why I must speak honestly now. Because if the church stops seeing the wounded, the poorest people will be abandoned first. That Friday morning in Ouagadougou began with a silence that did not feel peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes before difficult news, when every person in the room already knows the truth, but still waits for someone to place it on the table. I was inside the presidential palace, seated in a small meeting room not far from the central administrative district. The room was not large, and nothing inside it felt grand to me that morning. There were chairs, files, maps, notebooks, and the tired faces of men and women who had spent too many days listening to reports of villages cut off, roads threatened, families displaced, and children growing up with fear as part of their daily language. In front of me lay a map of Burkina Faso. I had looked at that map many times before, but that morning it looked different. It did not look like a national document. It looked like a wounded body. The north carried its own marks, the east carried its own burden, the center nord, the Sahel, and Bouclé du Mahon were not just names written on paper. They were places where mothers had packed what little they could carry. They were places where fathers had disappeared on roads that were no longer safe. They were places where schools had closed, health centers had struggled, and people had learned to measure each day by whether there would be food, water, or news from home. Prime Minister Rimtalba Jean-Emmanuel Ouedraogo sat near me, listening carefully. Beside him was Captain Adama Zongo, the officer responsible for presenting the security report that morning. On my other side was Mariam Ilbudo, my social advisor, whose files were always full of human details that military maps could not show. Captain Zongo spoke in a steady voice, but what he said was heavy. He pointed to areas where communities remained under pressure. He explained which roads were difficult to secure. He named the communes that had become isolated. He spoke about families who could not return to their homes, children who could not attend school, clinics that could not receive medicine, and farmers who had missed planting seasons because the land around them had become unsafe. Then Mariam opened another file. Her report did not speak first about weapons or routes, it spoke about people. She reminded us that about 4.5 million people were expected to need humanitarian support during the year 2026. She spoke of more than 2 million people who had once been displaced by violence. She spoke of families who had already lived away from their homes for years, not months. She spoke of mothers who had become both parents, of elders who had lost their land, and of communities receiving more displaced people than they had resources to support. As I listened, I felt the danger of numbers. Numbers can help a leader understand the size of a crisis, but they can also protect the heart from feeling it. When a report says millions, a person may nod and continue. But when a mother says, "My child has not eaten properly," the distance disappears. That morning, I forced myself not to hide behind the numbers. I looked again at the map and saw more than red marks. I imagined a woman walking with her children before sunrise because she feared staying in her village. I imagined an old man sitting outside a temporary shelter, remembering the house he built with his own hands. I imagined a pastor trying to comfort families when he himself did not know whether the next road would be safe. I imagined a priest burying someone whose relatives could not all come because the journey was too dangerous. Then, while Captain Zongo continued speaking, I heard church bells in the distance. The sound was faint, but it entered the room clearly enough to pull my thoughts away from the map for a moment. It was a simple sound, familiar to many communities, a sound that usually calls people to prayer, worship, memory, and hope. But that morning it did not comfort me immediately. It asked me a question. When a nation is bleeding, what should the church be doing? I did not ask that question with anger. I did not ask it as a man who wanted to judge every pastor, every priest, every nun, or every believer. I knew too many Christians were already serving with courage. I had heard of church women cooking for displaced families when they had little food themselves. I had heard of small congregations sharing blankets, water, medicine, and prayer. I had heard of priests, pastors, and nuns staying close to communities when many others had left. That was real, and I respected it. But another reality was also real. In some places, the church had become careful in a way that troubled me. Some leaders were speaking only in safe language. Some sermons were full of comfort but empty of truth. Some communities prayed loudly inside buildings but seemed unsure how to stand beside the wounded outside them. Some feared being misunderstood. Some feared armed groups. Some feared losing donors, influence, or protection. Some feared trouble so much that silence began to look like wisdom. I understood fear. No honest leader should pretend fear is not real in a wounded country. But I also knew this. When shepherds become silent, sheep do not stop suffering. They only suffer with fewer voices defending them. The bells continued for a short while, then faded into the noise of the city. But the question remained in the room with me. It stayed on the table beside the maps, beside the reports, beside the names of isolated communities and hungry families. I looked at the people around me and said very little for a moment. I did not want to speak too quickly. Some questions deserve silence before they deserve words. By the time the meeting ended, I had already decided that security reports were not enough. Humanitarian reports were not enough. Political meetings were not enough. I needed to hear from those who stood closest to the suffering people. I needed to hear from pastors, priests, nuns, displaced mothers, and believers who still carried faith in places where hope had become fragile. So I asked for a private meeting with religious leaders and community voices that same day. I did not want ceremony. I did not want official speeches. I did not want anyone to come and tell me what they thought a president wanted to hear. I wanted the truth. Because that morning, with the map of crisis before me and the sound of church bells behind me, I understood something clearly. The crisis of a nation is never only about roads, food, weapons, borders, or politics. It is also about the conscience of the people. It is about whether those who speak of God can still hear the cries of those who suffer. And if the church could not stand outside the pain of Burkina Faso, then I had to ask where it was standing. Later that same morning, around 10 o'clock, I entered a smaller conference room in Ouagadougou. There were security officers outside the door, but inside the room there was no feeling of power. There was only a heavy quietness. I had asked for a meeting with people who could speak not only about religion, but about the daily suffering of ordinary families. I did not want famous speeches. I did not want carefully prepared statements. I did not want words designed to protect reputations. I wanted to hear what was really happening in the Christian communities that were living under pressure. Sister Bernadette Sawadogo sat near the end of the table. She was a Catholic nun, calm in her face but tired in her eyes. Pastor Matthew Kabore had come from Kaya, carrying the burden of many displaced families who had entered his community. Father Joseph Tapsoba came from the Center Nord, where fear and need had changed the rhythm of parish life, and beside them sat Awa Traoré, a Christian woman who had been displaced from her home and had agreed to speak not as a leader but as a mother. I looked at each of them before I spoke. I said, "Today I am not asking you to flatter anyone, I am not asking you to defend the government, and I am not asking you to attack it, I am asking you to tell the truth. What is happening among our people? What is happening inside the church? What are believers carrying that we are not seeing clearly enough?" For a moment, no one answered. That silence told me something before any words were spoken. It told me that the truth was not absent. It was present, but it was painful. Sometimes people do not remain silent because they have nothing to say. They remain silent because they know that once the truth is spoken, nobody in the room can pretend not to have heard it. Sister Bernadette finally opened a worn notebook and placed it on the table. It was not a large book, but when she opened it, the room seemed to grow heavier. "These are families," she said softly, "not statistics, families." The pages were filled with names. Some names had notes beside them: a widow with children, an elderly man without medicine, a family living in a temporary shelter, a child separated from relatives, a mother who had lost her husband on the road, a household that had not returned home for more than 3 years. I looked at the notebook, and for a moment, all the official reports I had read became human in a different way. I had already known that about 1.6 million people needed urgent food support. I had already heard that more than 223,000 people faced severe emergency levels of hunger, but when Sister Bernadette placed those names before me, the crisis no longer had distance. It had handwriting. Then Awa Traoré began to speak. She did not speak loudly. She did not speak like someone who wanted attention. She spoke like a woman who had cried so much that her voice had learned to survive without force. She told us her husband had died while they were fleeing their village. She did not give many details, and I did not ask her to. Some wounds should not be opened for the comfort of listeners. She said that after his death, she continued walking with what remained of her family. She carried what she could. She left behind what she loved. She arrived in a place where others were also broken, and there she tried to live. Then she said something I did not forget. I still go to church every week, she said, not because all my questions are answered. I go because sometimes it is the only place left where I can cry before God. The room stayed silent again. I looked at Pastor Matthew. His face had changed. He knew her story, but hearing it in that room made it heavier. Father Joseph lowered his eyes. Sister Bernadette kept her hand on the notebook, as if the names inside it were people she was personally protecting. At that moment, I understood more deeply what the church meant for many people in our country. For some, it was not simply a building with songs and prayers. It was the last place where they could bring grief without being told to hurry. It was the last place where a widow could sit and not explain why her eyes were empty. It was the last place where a hungry child might receive food, where a frightened family might hear that they were not forgotten, where someone who had lost everything could still feel seen. That is why the condition of the church matters. If the church becomes only a place of ceremony, then people like Awa lose more than a service. They lose a refuge. If the church becomes afraid to speak of real suffering, then the poor begin to wonder whether even God's people have turned their faces away. If the church protects its image more than it protects the wounded, then something sacred begins to weaken from within. I did not say all of this aloud immediately. I only listened. Pastor Matthew then said, "Mr. President, many believers are tired. They still believe in God, but they are asking whether the church still sees them. Some leaders are serving with courage, but others are afraid. They speak of peace, but they do not speak of what stole peace from the people. They speak of hope, but they do not always stand close enough to the hopeless." His words did not sound like accusation, they sounded like grief. And grief is sometimes more honest than anger. I looked again at the notebook. I thought about every name written there. I thought about families who had been away from home for years. I thought about those who needed food, shelter, medicine, and protection. I thought about the church bells I had heard earlier that morning. Those bells were still ringing in my memory. I realized then that the question was no longer simple. It was not only where is the church, it was also what kind of church will remain after fear has tested it. A church can survive with little money. It can survive with small buildings. It can survive without influence, without praise, without comfort. But can it survive if it loses courage? Can it survive if the poor no longer feel seen? Can it survive if its prayers are loud but its compassion becomes quiet? That meeting did not give me easy answers, but it gave me something more important. It gave me the truth, spoken by people who had paid a price to carry it. And once I heard it, I knew I could not return to silence. By midday, the room had changed. It was the same room, the same table, the same chairs, the same glasses of water, and the same papers spread before us. Yet something in the air had shifted. The meeting had moved beyond reports. It had entered the place where people no longer speak to protect themselves, but because silence has become too painful. The notebook of Sister Bernadette remained open on the table. The names inside it seemed to watch us. There were maps beside it, lists of displaced families, notes about isolated communes, and pages marked with urgent needs. Food, medicine, shelter, water, school access, protection. Those words appeared simple on paper, but in the life of a poor family, each one could become the difference between hope and despair. I looked at Pastor Matthew Kabore and asked him to continue. He took a breath before speaking. I could see that he did not want his words to be misunderstood. In a country under pressure, every honest sentence can feel dangerous. A pastor may fear the government will hear criticism where he intended compassion. He may fear armed groups will hear defiance where he intended truth. He may fear donors will hear discomfort where he intended honesty. But after a moment he spoke. "Mr. President," he said, "some churches have learned how to remain silent." No one interrupted him. That sentence entered the room and stayed there. He did not say the whole church was silent. He did not accuse every congregation, every priest, every pastor, or every believer. He was careful, and his care mattered. There were Christians in Burkina Faso who had risked comfort, safety, and reputation to serve the wounded. There were small churches feeding people when they barely had enough for themselves. There were women of faith cooking for children who were not their own. There were priests and pastors walking into places where many others were afraid to go. But Pastor Matthew was saying something different. He was saying that another kind of church also existed, a church that still gathered, a church that still sang, a church that still preached, a church that still held services. But somewhere along the way, it had learned to avoid the heaviest truths. Father Joseph Tapsoba leaned forward and added, "Some sermons still speak about peace, but they avoid naming the things that have stolen peace from the people." That sentence wounded me, not because it was an attack, but because it sounded true. I had heard sermons like that in many places, not only in Burkina Faso. Words of comfort are necessary. People need to hear that God has not abandoned them. A widow needs hope. A displaced father needs strength. A frightened child needs reassurance. But when comfort refuses to look at reality, it becomes too soft to carry suffering. Peace is not only a beautiful word. Peace is safety on the road. Peace is a mother knowing her child will eat. Peace is a school opening without fear. Peace is a clinic receiving medicine. Peace is a farmer returning to his field. Peace is a family sleeping without listening for violence in the dark. If the church speaks of peace but cannot speak of hunger, displacement, fear, corruption of conscience, and the loneliness of the poor, then its words begin to float above the people instead of standing among them. I listened without interrupting. Inside me, I felt the difficulty of what they were saying. Fear was not imaginary. In many areas of the north and the east, communities had suffered under the pressure of armed groups. Roads had become uncertain, villages had been emptied, families had been forced into places they did not choose. When people live under threat, courage is no longer a simple word, it becomes a daily cost. So I did not sit there like a man who had never known danger, demanding bravery from people whose lives were already fragile. But I also could not ignore the question rising in me. If the shepherd is afraid to speak, where will the sheep go? Pastor Matthew continued, and his voice became lower. He said some church leaders feared being accused of taking sides, some feared being seen as political, some feared losing permission, losing donors, losing safety, or losing the protection of powerful people. Others had grown comfortable with a religious life that looked clean from the outside but did not touch the wounds of the people deeply enough. Sister Bernadette closed her notebook gently and said, "The poor know when they are being avoided." That was perhaps the hardest sentence of the day. The poor know. They may not always have the language of politics. They may not have microphones, offices, or influence. They may not appear in meetings where decisions are made, but they know when leaders come only for photographs. They know when religious people pray for them but do not sit with them. They know when a church has food but no welcome. They know when a sermon is beautiful but does not have room for their grief. Awa Traoré looked down at her hands. She did not speak immediately, but her silence became part of the conversation. I thought of what she had said earlier, that she still went to church because it was sometimes the only place left where she could cry before God. What happens when even that place becomes afraid of tears? That question stayed with me. I thought about the church as a refuge. I thought about the first believers, about the wounded, the hungry, the imprisoned, the strangers, and the forgotten. I thought about Jesus standing close to people whom society pushed aside. I thought about the danger of a faith that speaks his name but becomes uncomfortable with the people he touched. I did not want the church to become a political tool. I did not want pastors to become government spokesmen. I did not want priests to become party voices. Faith loses something sacred when it becomes only an instrument of power. But the opposite danger is also real. The church must not become a hiding place from truth. There is a difference between being wise and being silent because silence is safer. There is a difference between avoiding hatred and avoiding responsibility. There is a difference between refusing propaganda and refusing to see the suffering of the people. That day I began to understand that some churches were not dying because their doors were closed, their doors were open, their songs were still loud, their prayers were still long, their services still continued. But something inside them was becoming weaker. Moral courage was becoming tired. Compassion was becoming cautious. Truth was being softened until it could no longer disturb anyone. I looked around the room and said, I understand fear, but I fear something else even more. I fear a church that survives by becoming invisible to the wounded. No one answered quickly. There are moments when the truth does not need a response, it only needs to be allowed to remain. That was the first thing few dared to say aloud. Some churches had learned the language of silence. Not all churches, not all leaders, not all believers, but enough for the poor to feel it, enough for the young to question it, and enough for my conscience to refuse to ignore it. And once that truth had been spoken in that small room in Ouagadougou, I knew the next step could not be another meeting only. I needed to go where the wounded people were. I needed to see Awa Traoré again, not across a conference table, but in the place where faith had become her last shelter. 3 days after that meeting in Ouagadougou, I traveled to Kaya, in the Center Nord. I did not go there looking for a speech. I went because some truths cannot be understood from a chair in the Capitol. They must be heard where people sleep, where they cook, where they wait, and where they try to believe that tomorrow will still come. Kaya had become more than a city on a map. It had become a place where many displaced families carried the remains of their old lives. Some had arrived with bags, some had arrived with children, some had arrived with memories so painful they could not speak of them without lowering their voices. Many had lived for a long time in communities that were never prepared to carry so much suffering. When I arrived near a local church, I saw temporary shelters close to the area. There were families gathered in small spaces, women preparing food, children moving quietly, and elders sitting with the kind of patience that comes when people have waited too long for life to become normal again. Pastor Mathieu Kabore was there. He walked with me toward one of the shelters and said, "Awa is inside." I remembered her from the meeting. I remembered her soft voice, her story, and the sentence she had spoken about going to church because it was the only place left where she could cry before God. She stepped out when she saw us. She did not rush. She greeted me with respect, but there was no performance in her manner. Pain had made her direct. Suffering often removes the desire to impress powerful people. She invited me to see the place where she lived. It was small, but she had kept it as orderly as she could. There were only a few possessions inside: a thin mat, a small bag, 2 sets of clothing, a cooking pot, a worn Bible that looked as if it had survived both dust and tears. She noticed me looking at it. "That is what I still have," she said. Then she told me about the life she had before. She had a home. She had a small field. She had a husband. She had goats. She had neighbors whose names she knew, and a church where people recognized her voice when she sang. Her life was not rich, but it was whole enough for her to call it hers. Then one day fear entered that life and broke it. She did not describe everything. She only said that she fled, and her husband did not survive the journey. I did not press her for details. A leader must learn when questions become cruelty. Sometimes it is enough to know that a human being has suffered. Her son Daniel stood near her. He was a boy of 12 years, but his eyes carried a seriousness that did not belong to his age. He watched everything carefully, as if childhood had taught him to be alert before it taught him to be free. Awa looked at me and said, "Mr. President, I did not ask first for money because many people need money. I know I am not the only one, but I want to ask you something." I waited. She said, "If God still sees us, why do many people in the church not see us?" That question did not accuse me directly, yet I felt it deeply. It was not a question made for debate. It was not a question from someone who wanted to challenge doctrine or attack Christianity. It was the question of a woman who still believed in God, but wondered why some of God's people had become difficult to find in the places where suffering was greatest. I had no quick answer. Sometimes silence is the only honest response a leader can give. Outside the shelter, women from the local Christian community were preparing porridge for children. They did not have much. The pot was large, but the need around it was larger. One woman stirred slowly while another counted small bowls. A third woman tried to calm a child who was crying from hunger and exhaustion. They were not making speeches about compassion. They were practicing it. I watched them and thought about the difference between faith as a sound and faith as a shelter. Faith as a sound can fill a building. Faith as a shelter can hold a broken person. Faith as a sound can impress a crowd. Faith as a shelter can feed a hungry child. Faith as a sound can speak loudly about heaven. Faith as a shelter asks who is suffering on earth. Awa's question remained inside me. If God still sees us, why do many people in the church not see us? I thought about churches with strong voices but weak presence. I thought about religious leaders who were afraid to speak too clearly. I thought about believers who had grown tired, cautious, or distant. I also thought about those who were doing the hard work quietly, without cameras, without praise, and without enough resources. I did not want to condemn the entire church, because that would be false. The women cooking there were part of the church. Pastor Mathieu was part of the church. Sister Bernadette was part of the church. Father Joseph was part of the church. The believers who shared food when they had little were part of the church. But Awa was not asking about the faithful few only. She was asking about the larger body. She was asking why suffering people could sometimes feel invisible to institutions that spoke every week about love, mercy, and the compassion of Christ. That is a serious question. I looked at Daniel again. He was standing beside his mother, listening. I wondered what he would remember when he became older. Would he remember the church as a place that looked away, or as a people who helped his mother survive? Would he remember faith as words spoken over microphones, or as hands that brought food when his family had nothing? For the young, these memories become theology before they ever read books. They learn what God is like by watching what believers do when people are suffering. Before leaving that shelter, I told Awa, "Your question will not leave me." She nodded, but I could see that words alone were not enough. She had heard many words in her life. She needed a country that protected families, and she needed a church that remembered the wounded. As I stepped back into the open air, the dust of Kaya moved lightly across the ground. Behind me was a woman with an old Bible and 2 sets of clothes. In front of me were children waiting for porridge. Around me were believers doing what they could with too little. And inside me, one truth became clearer. Real faith is not proven by how loudly we speak when people are comfortable. It is proven by whether we stand beside them when they have been abandoned. That afternoon in Kaya, I walked behind the small church where the women had been preparing food. There was no grand building there. There were no shining lights, no large stage, no expensive sound system, and no impressive sign at the entrance. There were only plastic chairs, a large pot of porridge, a few containers of water, sacks of rice, folded blankets, tired volunteers, and displaced families waiting with quiet patience. Yet in that place I felt something stronger than ceremony. I felt mercy at work. A young volunteer named Paul Yameogo came to greet me. His clothes were simple, and his face showed the exhaustion of someone who had been serving for many days without enough rest. He did not speak like a man looking for praise. He spoke like someone who had accepted that the need was too great, but had refused to let that become an excuse for doing nothing. He told me that the church was feeding more than 80 people each day. Some days they had enough food, other days they had to divide what little they had and trust that tomorrow would bring something more. They shared rice, medicine, blankets, water, and simple meals. When they could not give people everything they needed, they still tried to give them one thing many had lost, the feeling that they had not been forgotten. Paul said, "Mr. President, we are not rich. Sometimes we have almost nothing left. But when people come here hungry, we cannot tell them to come back after we become comfortable." That sentence stayed with me. We cannot wait to become comfortable before we become compassionate. I looked around and saw the truth of his words. A woman was giving water to an elderly man. Another volunteer was checking on a child who looked weak. A group of women was dividing food carefully, making sure the smallest children received something first. Pastor Mathieu moved from one family to another, not as a man above them, but as a servant among them. This was not a church with great power. This was a church with mercy. And sometimes mercy is more powerful than influence. As I stood there, I thought about other places I had seen. Some churches had larger buildings, some had better resources, some had more educated leaders, stronger connections, and greater public attention. Some knew how to speak beautifully about faith, blessing, hope, and victory, but I wondered how many of them were present in the places where the wounded were actually waiting. A building can be full and still be far from pain. A choir can sing loudly and still not hear the hungry. A sermon can sound powerful and still leave the poor invisible. I do not say this to mock the church. I say it because love must be honest. A nation can hide behind flags and slogans. A church can hide behind music and religious language, but the poor can see what is real. They know who comes near. They know who stays away. They know who serves when nobody is watching. That small church in Kaya did not have much to protect except human life. Maybe that is why it felt close to the heart of the gospel. I thought about Jesus not as a decoration in a sermon, but as the one who touched lepers, fed crowds, noticed widows, welcomed children, spoke with the rejected, and stood near those whom society preferred to ignore. If the church carries his name, then it cannot be ashamed of the people he loved. A church that only seeks influence may become afraid of losing its place. A church that seeks mercy is willing to lose comfort to save lives. There is a difference. A church with power asks how it will be seen. A church with mercy asks who has not eaten. A church with power protects its image. A church with mercy protects the wounded. A church with power may wait for perfect conditions. A church with mercy begins with one bowl, one blanket, one prayer, one visit, one open door. I watched Paul lift a sack of rice with another volunteer. It was not a dramatic act. No crowd applauded. No camera followed him. But to the families waiting there, that sack of rice mattered more than many speeches. At that moment, I asked myself a hard question. Has part of the church become too busy protecting its appearance while another part is quietly protecting lives? I did not want that question to become a weapon. I did not want people to hear it and begin accusing one another. The purpose of truth is not always to shame. Sometimes it is to wake up what is still alive. The church in Burkina Faso still has light. I saw that light in Kaya. I saw it in Sister Bernadette's notebook. I saw it in Pastor Matthew's tired face. I saw it in Awa's old Bible. I saw it in women cooking porridge for children who were not their own. I saw it in Paul, who served without pretending that service was easy. But light must not remain trapped inside walls. A candle hidden in a beautiful room cannot guide someone walking in darkness outside. That afternoon, I understood something more clearly than before. The future of the church will not be decided only by how many people attend services, how beautiful the songs are, or how many leaders speak from the pulpit. It will be judged by a simpler question. When people were hungry, did the church feed them? When people were displaced, did the church see them? When young people were confused, did the church listen? When widows cried, did the church sit beside them? When fear entered the land, did the church become careful only for itself, or did it become courageous for the wounded? These questions are not easy, but they are necessary. Before I left the churchyard, I turned back once more. The sun was lowering, and the dust made the air look dry and tired, yet the people there were still serving. They did not have enough resources for the whole crisis. They could not solve everything. They could not rebuild every home, reopen every school, or heal every wound. But they were present. And presence matters. Sometimes the suffering person does not first ask for a perfect solution. Sometimes they ask to know whether someone still sees them. That is why I say this with a serious heart. The church does not need to become rich before it becomes faithful. It does not need to become powerful before it becomes useful. It does not need to control the nation before it can comfort the broken. It only needs to remember where Jesus would stand. And I believe he would not be far from that small churchyard in Kaya, where hungry families waited, where women served, where volunteers shared what little they had, and where mercy spoke louder than influence. About 1 week after I returned from Kaya, I met privately in Ouagadougou with a small group of pastors and community advisors. I did not want a public gathering. I did not want cameras, applause, or statements prepared for the outside world. And I wanted a room where people could speak without performing courage and without hiding fear. Mariam Ilbudo was present again, carrying her notes from the humanitarian visits. Pastor Emmanuel Basiono, a young pastor from Ouagadougou, sat across from me. Beside him was Etienne Complacency, a youth representative whose face carried the impatience of a generation that had heard many promises but seen too little change. The conversation began quietly. We spoke about displaced families, food shortages, closed schools, broken trust, and the pressure many young people were carrying. Burkina Faso is a young country in spirit and population. Many of our young people are full of strength, but strength without direction can become anger. Hope without opportunity can become bitterness. Faith without honesty can become confusion. Pastor Emmanuel looked at me and said something I did not expect. Mr. President, many young people are not leaving God. They are leaving a church that does not dare to speak truthfully. The room became still. I asked him to explain. He said many young people still pray. Many still respect Jesus. Many still believe there is something sacred beyond politics, money, and survival. But they are tired of hearing beautiful words that do not touch their real lives. They hear sermons about peace, but they return to homes where parents cannot find enough food. They hear sermons about destiny, but they cannot find work. They hear sermons about victory, but they live with fear, insecurity, and uncertainty. They hear leaders speak about morality, but they do not always see moral courage. Etienne leaned forward and spoke with a directness that young people often carry when they are tired of polite language. He said, "We are told to be patient, but many of us do not know what we are waiting for. We are told to believe, but we also want the church to tell the truth about poverty, violence, fear, and the way people are being forgotten." I listened carefully. There was no hatred in his voice. There was disappointment, and disappointment is sometimes more dangerous than anger. Angry people still believe someone should hear them. Disappointed people begin to walk away quietly. That is what worried me. I did not fear young people asking hard questions. A country should not fear questions. A church should not fear questions. A leader should not fear questions. I feared a generation that would stop asking because it had decided nobody was listening. Pastor Emmanuel continued. He said that in some churches, young people were given advice but not understanding. They were given religious phrases but not honest conversation. They were told to avoid sin, but few leaders sat with them long enough to understand unemployment, hopelessness, trauma, displacement, and the temptations that grow when a person feels invisible. I thought of young men who had left villages because of insecurity. I thought of young women carrying families after losing fathers, husbands, or brothers. I thought of students whose schools had been interrupted. I thought of children growing into adulthood inside a crisis they did not create. A pulpit that avoids such pain may still sound spiritual, but it becomes distant. That was what troubled me most. When the pulpit avoids the truth, the street becomes the classroom. When the church does not listen, anger listens. When faith leaders do not speak honestly, other voices enter the silence. Some of those voices may promise quick power. Some may promise revenge. Some may promise escape. Some may promise identity through hatred. Some may teach young people to despise their own communities. Some may turn suffering into a weapon. This is why truth matters. Truth is not cruelty, truth is not rebellion, truth is not disrespect. Truth is a form of love when it refuses to let people die behind polite words. I told Pastor Emmanuel and Etienne that I understood the danger of careless speech. Words can inflame a wounded country. Words can divide communities. Words can be used by people who do not want peace. But silence also has danger. Silence can make injustice feel normal. Silence can make the poor feel invisible. Silence can make the young believe faith is only a performance for older people. The church must not become reckless, but it must not become afraid of reality. I opened my notebook and wrote a sentence that came to me as they spoke. When the pulpit avoids the truth, the street will become the place where young people search for answers. I read the sentence again after writing it. It was simple, but it carried weight. I knew it was not only a warning to pastors, it was also a warning to me. If government offices avoid truth, people will search elsewhere. If leaders speak only in slogans, citizens will stop trusting official words. If we reduce suffering to numbers, people will look for someone who remembers their names. So I could not sit there and speak as if only the church needed examination. I also had to examine leadership itself. Still, that day, my concern for the church became sharper. A church that cannot speak to young people in their real condition will lose them, even if it keeps its buildings. A church that only repeats safe phrases will not guide a generation surrounded by danger. A church that speaks of heaven but refuses to discuss the wounds of earth will sound holy to itself, but empty to those who are bleeding. I thought again of Awa and Kaya. I thought of Daniel, her son, watching adults with serious eyes. What would the church mean to him when he became a man? Would he remember songs only, or would he remember people who helped his mother stand? Would he see Christian faith as a living mercy, or as a language spoken by people who stayed far from suffering? The answer would not come from one sermon. It would come from years of presence. Pastor Emmanuel said, "The young do not need the church to become political, they need it to become honest." That sentence helped me understand the difference. Honesty does not mean turning the church into a party. Honesty does not mean turning worship into propaganda. Honesty does not mean replacing prayer with anger. Honesty means refusing to pretend people are fine when they are not. It means refusing to speak of peace while ignoring the reasons people have no peace. It means refusing to tell the poor to be patient while never standing close enough to feel their hunger. I looked at Etienne and asked him what he wanted from the church. He did not take long to answer. He said, "I want the church to stop being afraid of our questions." That was all. Not power, not entertainment, not perfection. He wanted the church to stop being afraid of questions. I thought about how many institutions fail because they become afraid of the people they claim to serve. Governments can do this, churches can do this, families can do this, leaders can do this. They begin by wanting order, but slowly they confuse order with silence. They begin by wanting respect, but slowly they confuse respect with fear. That path is dangerous. A young person who cannot ask questions in the church may ask them in the street. A young person who cannot bring pain before a pastor may bring it before a stranger. A young person who cannot find truth in a place of faith may begin to believe truth does not live there. That is why I left that meeting with a deeper burden. The crisis was not only hunger, displacement, or insecurity, it was also trust. Trust between people and leaders, trust between the poor and institutions, trust between the young and those who claim to guide them, trust between the church and the wounded communities around it. Once trust is broken, songs alone cannot repair it. Only truth, humility, and service can begin that work. That evening, as I left the room, I knew the message forming inside me was becoming clearer. I was not asking the church to become loud for the sake of being loud. I was not asking it to seek conflict. I was asking it to recover moral courage. Because a pulpit that cannot face truth may still produce sound, but it cannot produce healing. That night, around 11 o'clock, I sat alone in my private office at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The building was quiet, but my mind was not. On the desk before me were the same things that had followed me for days: the national map, the humanitarian reports, my notebook, and the names of people whose lives had become heavier than any official document could explain. The lamp on my desk gave just enough light for me to read, but not enough to make the room feel warm. Outside, the city was still alive in small sounds, distant vehicles, footsteps, and the low movement of a capital that never fully sleeps. But inside that office, I felt the weight of the conversations I had heard. Awa's question returned first. If God still sees us, why do many people in the church not see us? Then I remembered Sister Bernadette's notebook. I remembered the pages filled with names, each one standing for a family, a wound, a hunger, a grief. I remembered Pastor Matthew saying that some churches had learned how to remain silent. I remembered Father Joseph saying that some sermons spoke of peace while avoiding the things that had stolen peace from the people. I remembered Etienne saying that young people were not leaving God, but leaving a church that did not dare to speak truthfully. I had asked hard questions about the church. But that night, I understood that I could not stop there. A man who leads a country has no right to question the conscience of others while protecting his own heart from examination. If I asked the church whether it still saw the poor, then I had to ask myself whether the state saw them clearly enough. If I asked pastors whether they were speaking truth, then I had to ask whether political leaders were also speaking truth. If I asked priests and believers whether they were close to suffering, then I had to ask whether power itself had become too distant from the people. That was not an easy thought. It is easier for a leader to speak about what others must correct. It is harder to sit alone at night and ask whether his own office has become too comfortable with reports, numbers, and promises. I looked again at the humanitarian pages. About 4.5 million people needing support, families displaced, schools closed, clinics struggling, food insecurity growing in many places, people asking not for luxury but for safety, bread, medicine, and the right to return home. I had read these facts many times. But that night, I asked myself whether I had allowed some of them to become too familiar. That is one of the dangers of leadership. When pain becomes repeated, the heart can become trained to survive it by feeling less. A report comes, a meeting is held, a decision is discussed, another crisis appears, another file is opened, another number is added. Slowly, a leader can begin to speak about suffering in a language that protects him from being broken by it. But a nation cannot be healed by leaders who no longer feel the wounds of the people. I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence. A nation cannot be healed by slogans. Then I paused and wrote another. A church cannot be healed by beautiful sermons alone. Those two sentences belong together. A government can speak of security, development, sovereignty, and transition. A church can speak of hope, blessing, mercy, and heaven. But if those words do not bend down toward the hungry, the displaced, the widow, the orphan, the frightened student, and the forgotten farmer, then they become decorations on top of suffering. I did not want to become that kind of leader. I knew the transition period placed a heavy responsibility on the country. The road ahead was long, and the pressure of security, social trust, and national unity was real. People needed more than speeches. They needed protection, they needed food, they needed schools, they needed clinics, they needed roads that were safe enough for life to return. They needed a state that did not only speak of them in meetings but remembered them in decisions. And I also knew that criticism of the church would mean nothing if the state itself failed to listen. So I sat there and let the truth accuse me too. Had I listened deeply enough? Had I allowed the poor to become numbers? Had I sometimes accepted language that sounded strong but did not bring relief quickly enough? Had I seen Awa before she entered that room, or did I only see her after Sister Bernadette placed a notebook of names before me? These were not questions for public applause, they were questions for the soul. I thought of Daniel, Awa's son. I imagined him sleeping in a temporary shelter, growing older with memories of displacement instead of childhood security. He would not judge leaders by speeches. He would judge them by whether his mother was protected, whether he could return to school, whether he could one day go home. Children understand truth in simple ways. They ask, can we eat? They ask, are we safe? They ask, when can we go home? No ideology can replace those questions. No sermon can erase them. No political slogan can answer them unless action follows. That night, I understood that silence is not only a temptation for religious leaders, it is a temptation for everyone who carries responsibility. A president can become silent by speaking too much but saying too little. A minister can become silent by hiding behind procedures. A pastor can become silent by preaching comfort without courage. A citizen can become silent by deciding that another person's suffering is not his concern. Silence has many forms. Some silence is fear. Some silence is comfort. Some silence is fatigue. Some silence is calculation. Some silence is the slow death of compassion. I did not want that silence inside me. So I prayed in my own way, not with many words, but with the honesty of a man who knew that power could not save his soul if it separated him from truth. I asked God to keep my heart awake. I asked him to keep me from loving the image of leadership more than the duty of leadership. I asked him to help me see the people behind every report. When I closed the notebook, I did not feel lighter, but I felt clearer. The message I needed to give the church had to come with humility. I could not speak as if only pastors and priests needed courage. I had to speak as a leader who also needed courage. I had to admit that every institution, including the state, can become distant from the poor if it stops listening. A country cannot be healed by slogans. A church cannot be healed by beautiful sermons. And a leader cannot serve the people if he is afraid to let their suffering disturb him. That night in the quiet of my office, I knew the next words I would speak had to be honest but not arrogant. They had to be firm but not cruel. They had to remind the church of its calling while reminding me of my own responsibility. Because truth that only points outward is incomplete. Real truth also turns back and asks, "What about you?" Near the end of March, I stood before a gathering in Ouagadougou that I knew would not be easy. It was not a military meeting. It was not a political rally. It was not a ceremony where people came only to clap, smile, and repeat safe words. In that room were religious leaders, women, youth representatives, displaced families, local officials, and community voices who had carried too much pain for too long. Father Joseph Tapsoba was there. Pastor Mathieu Caboret was there. Sister Bernadette Sawadogo was there. Awa Traoré was there, sitting quietly among other women. Etienne Compaoré was there too, watching with the serious face of a young man who wanted more than promises. I looked at them and understood that I had to choose my words carefully. Not carefully because I wanted to hide the truth, but carefully because truth spoken without love can become another wound. I did not want to shame the church. I did not want to make believers feel attacked. I did not want to turn faith into politics or worship into a weapon, but I also knew that if I softened the message too much, the poor would once again be asked to carry the cost of other people's comfort. So I began plainly. I said, I am not here to command the church. I am not here to control the church. I am not here to make the church serve the government. The church must never become the servant of political power. But the church must also never become a hiding place from truth. The room stayed quiet. I continued because I knew many people were listening not only with their ears, but with their wounds. I said that the church has a sacred place in society, not because it owns buildings, not because it has leaders, not because it holds services, and not because people gather under its roof. The church has a sacred place when it becomes a shelter for the wounded, a voice for the forgotten, a table for the hungry, and a home for those who have lost almost everything. I said the danger facing the church is not only that it may become poor, it is not only that it may become smaller, it is not only that it may be criticized. The greater danger is that the church may remain full, remain loud, remain organized, and still stop hearing the cry of the poor. Those words were hard, but I believe they were necessary. A church can lose money and remain faithful. A church can lose popularity and remain faithful. A church can lose comfort and remain faithful. But if the church loses mercy, what remains? If it loses courage, what remains? If it loses the ability to look at a widow, a hungry child, a displaced family, and a young person full of questions, then what exactly is it protecting? I looked toward Awa without naming her. I remembered her question in Kaya, if God still sees us, why do many people in the church not see us? That question had followed me into every meeting since then. So I said to the room, do not be afraid of losing influence. Be afraid of losing your soul. I did not mean that as an insult. I meant it as a warning to every institution that carries moral responsibility. A government can lose its soul when it loves power more than people. A church can lose its soul when it loves image more than mercy. A leader can lose his soul when he becomes too proud to listen. A nation can lose its soul when suffering becomes normal. The church must not fear truth more than it fears spiritual emptiness. Some people think influence is the sign of life. They count crowds, they count buildings, they count connections, they count invitations, they count how many people know their names. But the gospel does not begin with influence. It begins with love. It begins with mercy. It begins with the wounded person on the road. It begins with bread shared, tears seen, sins forgiven, and truth spoken even when it is costly. I said, if the church only speaks when it is safe, then who will speak when the poor are in danger? The faces in the room told me the question had reached them. I was not speaking against Christian faith. I was speaking because I respected what faith should be. I respected the pastors who stayed close to their people. I respected the priests who buried the dead and comforted families. I respected the nuns who wrote down names so the forgotten would not disappear. I respected the small congregations that fed children with little food and less money. I respected the believers who did not wait for perfect conditions before they acted with compassion. But respect for the faithful does not require silence about the fearful. I told them that Burkina Faso is a country where Christians live beside Muslims and people of other convictions. Our society depends on coexistence, respect, and shared responsibility. No community can heal the nation alone. No religion should seek to dominate the pain of the people, but every faith community must ask whether it is serving the wounded with honesty. The Christian church must not become an enemy of Muslims. It must not become an instrument of political ambition. It must not become a stage for pride. It must become what it claims to be, a place where the wounded are bandaged, where the hungry are noticed, where the young are heard, and where truth is not buried under beautiful words. I looked at Etienne and thought about the young people he represented. I said, "Do not be afraid of their questions. A generation that questions is not automatically lost. A generation that is ignored may become lost." Young people are not asking the church to be perfect. Many of them are asking the church to be real. They want to know whether faith can speak to unemployment, fear, violence, displacement, loneliness, corruption of conscience, and the feeling that tomorrow is uncertain. They want to know whether Jesus is only spoken about in sermons or whether his compassion still lives in the hands of his people. If the church refuses those questions, others will answer them. And not every answer will lead to life. I then spoke about the displaced families. I said that families who have lost homes do not need only words about patience. They need protection, food, water, schools, medicine, and people willing to stand close enough to help carry their burden. Prayer is holy, but prayer that refuses responsibility becomes incomplete. Worship is beautiful, but worship that cannot hear the hungry child outside the door becomes dangerous. I could see Sister Bernadette listening with her hands folded. I thought of her notebook again. Names, families, widows, children, elders. The poor do not live as ideas, they live as names. So I said, when you preach, remember names. When you pray, remember faces. When you speak of peace, remember those who have no safe road home. That was the heart of what I wanted to say. The church does not need to become loud in anger. It needs to become deep in courage. It does not need to chase conflict. It needs to stop fleeing truth. It does not need to become rich before it serves. It needs to become present. I knew some people would misunderstand me. Some would say I was criticizing religion. Some would say I was trying to use religion. Some would hear only the surface and miss the wound beneath the words. But I could not control every interpretation. I could only speak what conscience required. I ended that message with a simple thought. The church still has light. I have seen it. I have seen it in Kaya. I have seen it among women who cook for displaced children. I have seen it among pastors and priests who stay close to danger. I have seen it in believers who serve without applause. But that light must not remain behind walls. It must go where the night is heaviest. When I finished, nobody rushed to clap. And I was grateful for that. Some messages should not end with applause. They should end with reflection. I looked across the room and saw Awa sitting quietly. I saw Etienne looking down as if he was thinking. I saw Pastor Matthew with tired eyes but a steady face. I saw Father Joseph holding his hands together. I saw Sister Bernadette watching the room like someone who knew that truth had entered but work still remained. That day I did not leave believing everything had changed, but I believed something had been named. And sometimes before healing can begin, someone must finally say what everyone has been carrying in silence. When the meeting ended that late afternoon in Ouagadougou, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel that a speech had solved anything. Truth had been spoken, but truth is not the same as healing. Truth opens the door. Healing still requires people to walk through it. I stepped outside the room slowly. The air carried the dry dust of the city, and the light of the day had begun to soften. Near the courtyard, there were aid vehicles, local workers, and several displaced families waiting to speak with community representatives. From somewhere nearby, I could hear a faint sound of prayer. It did not sound organized or loud. It sounded like people holding on. I saw Awa Traoré standing not far away. Beside her was Daniel, her son. He held a small piece of bread that had been given to him by one of the relief workers. He was not eating it quickly. He held it carefully, as if he had already learned that food should not be wasted, because tomorrow was never guaranteed. That sight stayed with me. A child should not have to learn hunger before he learns peace. A child should not have to measure life by shelters, aid lines, and the fear in his mother's face. A child should not have to ask questions that adults, governments, churches, and communities have failed to answer. Daniel looked at me with serious eyes. He did not ask me about politics. He did not ask me about power. He did not ask me about meetings, titles, speeches, or plans. His question was much simpler. "Mr. President," he asked, "when will we go home?" I had heard many difficult questions in my life, but that one entered me differently. When will we go home? That is the question behind every humanitarian report. That is the question behind every map marked with red points. That is the question behind every displaced family sitting under a temporary shelter. That is the question behind every closed school, every abandoned field, every mother who still keeps a key to a house she may not see again soon. Daniel did not ask for a theory, he asked for home. And in that moment, I understood again that every sermon, every policy, every prayer, every promise, and every speech must return to one simple test. Are people being protected? If a government speaks of the nation but forgets the family, it has failed. If a church speaks of heaven but forgets the wounded on earth, it has failed. If leaders speak of peace but do not face the reasons people cannot return home, then peace becomes only a word. I looked at Daniel, and I wanted to give him an answer that would comfort him, but I also knew that false comfort is another form of disrespect. So I told him that we were working for that day, that his question mattered, and that no child should be forgotten in the struggle to rebuild our country. But inside myself, I knew words were not enough. Awa placed her hand near her son's shoulder. She did not interrupt. She had heard too many promises from too many people to be easily moved by a sentence. Her life had taught her to listen for actions, not only words. I respected that. As I walked toward the vehicle waiting for me, I turned back once more. I saw Sister Bernadette speaking with a group of women. I saw Pastor Matthew standing with local workers. I saw Father Joseph talking quietly with an elderly man. I saw Etienne speaking with young people near the edge of the courtyard. None of them looked triumphant. They looked burdened. But maybe that was right. Anyone who truly sees the suffering of the people should feel burdened. A leader who does not feel burdened becomes dangerous. A church that does not feel burdened becomes empty. A nation that does not feel burdened by the pain of its poorest citizens begins to lose its soul. The Christian church in Burkina Faso still has light. I believe that. I saw that light in the women cooking porridge in Kaya. I saw it in the old Bible Awa still carried. I saw it in Sister Bernadette's notebook of names. I saw it in volunteers who shared rice, water, blankets, medicine, and prayer. I saw it in pastors and priests who stayed close to people even when fear made distance easier. But light was never meant to remain hidden behind walls. If the church only shines inside its own building, then the people outside may still walk in darkness. If the church only speaks where it is safe, then the wounded may never hear the truth that could defend them. If the church only sings about love but does not move toward the hungry, then its songs become weaker than its silence. That is the thing I wanted to say honestly. A part of the church is not becoming weak because enemies outside are attacking it. A part of it is becoming weak because fear is teaching it to protect itself before it protects the wounded. Fear is teaching it to speak carefully when it should speak courageously. Fear is teaching it to preserve influence when it should preserve mercy. Fear is teaching it to avoid the poor because the poor carry problems too heavy for comfortable religion. But the gospel was never comfortable. Jesus did not build his witness by avoiding wounded people. He walked toward them, he saw them, he touched them, he listened to them, he spoke truth to power and mercy to the broken. If the church carries his name, it must not become ashamed of the places where he would stand. I do not ask the church to become a political machine. I do not ask pastors to become party voices. I do not ask priests to replace prayer with anger. I ask only this: do not abandon truth, do not abandon mercy, and do not abandon the people whose suffering makes comfortable people uncomfortable. That is the heart of everything I had seen. The church must not fear losing influence more than it fears losing compassion. It must not fear criticism more than it fears becoming blind to the poor. It must not fear difficult questions more than it fears losing the young. It must not fear standing near suffering more than it fears becoming spiritually empty. As the vehicle began to move away from the courtyard, the sound of prayer faded behind me. The red dust rose lightly from the road. I looked out at Ouagadougou and thought again of Daniel's question. When will we go home? That question did not belong only to one child. It belonged to a nation. It belonged to every displaced family. It belonged to every mother waiting for safety, every farmer waiting for land, every student waiting for school, every believer waiting to know whether the church still sees them. And it belonged to me. Because leadership is not only about giving answers. Sometimes it is about carrying the right questions until they force you to act. That day I left the room, but the question stayed behind in my heart. If the church no longer dares to stand beside the suffering, then are the bells still calling people toward God, or are they only covering a silence we are afraid to face? That is the truth I wanted to say. And that is the truth I could no longer ignore. After everything I saw, everything I heard, and every question that stayed with me, I understood one truth more clearly than before. Power alone cannot save a people. Money alone cannot heal a nation. Speeches alone cannot bring a wounded family back home. A country is not restored only by strength, and a church is not made alive only by songs, buildings, or beautiful words. Human beings are rescued by faith that remains honest, by compassion that becomes action, and by goodness that refuses to surrender to fear. Today the world has too much pain. There is too much war, too much hatred, too much greed, and too much indifference. I pray that better days will come for Burkina Faso, for Africa, for the people of America, and for every person across the world who still carries hope in a tired heart. Let us turn away from evil. Let us walk away from greed. Let us reject hatred before it destroys us. Let us return to the path of mercy, forgiveness, humility, and service. Even in the hardest season, do not lose hope. Light still exists for those who keep faith alive in their hearts. God is with us, with Burkina Faso, with Africa, and with the world. And if you also believe that goodness can still rise from suffering, leave a prayer from your heart and continue walking with us so that hope can reach more people.